Institute. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation this morning on school funding. Seeing a lot of people I know with names popping up in the box of attendees. Really glad you could join us this morning. There's nothing, that really gets a crowd going in the morning like a discussion of school funding. So, well, anyway, I think there'll be a lot to contemplate this morning and to think about, and hopefully, while it might not be energizing, hopefully it'll be thought-provoking. The last few years in education, there's been a tremendous amount of work to construct a new school funding system, and it is rightly, given the importance of school funding to education, dominating a lot of the headlines in newspapers. And that work to construct a system has, in the last month or so, transitioned to be very passionate debate. The one constant that I think that we've heard in these discussions since the beginning of these efforts was that Ohio's school funding system is unconstitutional. And this sort of made us think, because the court decisions that ruled it that way were a long time ago. So the question that we posed to ourselves is this still true? Is this accurate? And like much of Fordham's research, we didn't know what we'd find, whether we're studying the impact of on education of charter schools, or the use of school vouchers, or open enrollment. We ask the questions because we want to know the answers. So about 6 months ago, Aaron Churchill, the Ohio research director, began looking at the question and deconstructing the decision. He felt like he was in law school. He read so many briefs, and brought back bad memories of my own time in law school. What you're going to hear today is the byproduct of those efforts in the last 6 months that he spent analyzing the issues, trying to use data to get some clarity on where Ohio currently stands. And you know what? Without further ado, I think I'm going to transition over to Aaron, because you all certainly didn't come here to hear me speak. Aaron Churchill, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Sure. Well, thanks for the introduction, Chad. And as everybody in this room can tell, I've not been able to perfect the lockdown beard in the way that my boss has. But of course, we're not here to talk about facial hair, I think. We're here to talk about school funding. And as Chad mentioned, my name is Aaron Churchill, and I'm the Ohio Research Director for the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Today, I'll be presenting findings from a new Fordham report that was released a couple days ago that looks at the question of whether Ohio's school funding system is still unconstitutional. So let me put up the slides. Share the screen.
Aaron, while you're pulling up those slides, I will note to everyone that the chat feature is open. So you can type chats in there. And so if you want to send a message to Aaron or I, you can do that. And also you can put questions in that you want publicly asked into the Q&A box as well. So just to let you know, and after Aaron's presentation, I've got a question or two for him, and then we'll jump into audience questions. So thanks again for being here.
Yeah, and the way it'll work is I'll punt all the hard questions to Chad. No, I look forward to the questions at the end after the slideshow. Okay, so why are we talking about the constitutionality of Ohio's school funding system, and why now? Chad alluded to a little bit of this in his introductory remarks, but if you've been following the news over the past couple of years, you would certainly have noticed that school funding issues are front and center in the debates in Columbus. That's largely being driven, as many of us know, by a school funding proposal developed by House Speaker Bob Cupp and his House colleague Cupp-Patterson. And in the media coverage of their proposal, it's often reported and pretty much taken for granted that Ohio's school funding system is unconstitutional. This is a headline from a couple years ago, run shortly after the Cupp-Patterson plan was initially rolled out, that basically flat out says that the school funding system is unconstitutional. And not to pick on the Inquirer, but this is a recent line from the Cleveland Plain Dealer that likewise presumes the unconstitutionality of the school funding system. The quote reads, this was a lead in the article, the Ohio House is expected to vote Thursday on a bill, this is House Bill 305, the Cupp-Patterson plan, that will bring sweeping changes to how education is funded since the current scheme was found unconstitutional 23 years ago. What's sort of striking from the last clause is that it almost makes it sound like the judges could see into the future, as if they knew what the current scheme would look like 2 decades later. At any rate, what we can see is that there's this sort of presumption of the unconstitutionality of Ohio's education system, whether that's filtered through the media or in some cases through our policymakers as well. So where does this claim of unconstitutionality come from? Well, Ohio, like many other states, has had its funding system challenged in the courts. And among the recent cases, in 1979, the Ohio Supreme Court actually upheld the school funding system in a court case known as Board of Education versus Walter. In 1991, a coalition of 5 school districts in Ohio again challenged the funding model in DeRolph versus Ohio. It's important to note that since precedent upheld the system, the plaintiffs in DeRolph had to argue that the courts ought to review the system that was currently in place, not the one upheld a decade earlier. And that principle is important to remember. The current system should really be the one that's evaluated, not a system that was in place decades ago. In any case, the case did find its way to the Supreme Court, as many of us know, which ruled in 1997 in a 4-3 decision that the system was unconstitutional in violation of Section 6, Article 2 of the state constitution, which contains a thorough and efficient clause. We could certainly spend a lot more time on DeRolph itself, but the key issues the court objected to were as follows. One is the operation of the school foundation program. That's the state's central state aid program for school districts. The second issue they raised was the emphasis on local property taxes. The third issue they objected to was a required borrowing program for school districts in fiscal distress. We won't talk about this today. It was actually repealed shortly after DeRolph. And then the final thing they objected to was the lack of sufficient funding for school facilities. Okay, so fast forwarding a couple decades, we in this report, as Chad mentioned, wanted to ask whether Ohio has actually made improvements in its school funding program. Is the system still unconstitutional by any reasonable estimation? And to get a handle on this, I look at 4 specific questions. The first question is that the DeRolph lawsuit in technical terms is usually considered an adequacy lawsuit, claiming that Ohio did not adequately fund its schools. So the first question asks whether Ohio's school funding system today is adequate by any reasonable standard. The second question is that DeRolph also, as I mentioned, focused on the use of property taxes, and that's certainly a concern that continues to be heard today. So does Ohio rely excessively on property taxes? The third issue I look at in this paper, while DeRolph was not necessarily considered an equity lawsuit, concerns about the funding of high poverty schools still registers as a big concern, and it's certainly a legitimate one at that. So I ask in this paper, is Ohio's school funding system equitable? And then the last issue that I look in this report is a more recent one. Some people have raised concerns that the rise of school choice programs, which didn't exist at the time of DeRolph, things like vouchers and public charter schools may be hurting district finances, perhaps worsening some of the issues raised in the DeRolph ruling. So the final question in this report takes a look at whether school choice has eroded district funding in Ohio. All right, so moving over to the data that I present in this report. The first piece of data I look at is the long-term trend in school funding from 1990 to 2017, which is the most recent year of federally reported fiscal data. I use the federal data because it allows me to look at a longer trend line. What we see from this figure is that the statewide average spending adjusted for inflation is much higher today than it was in the 1990s when the DeRolph case was going through the courts. In 2017, Ohio spent $12,569 per pupil on average, while in 1990, the year in which DeRolph was first filed, the state spent just $8,589 per pupil. In 1997, the state spent $9,074 per pupil. Spending levels, as you can see in this chart, sort of really escalated between 2000 and 2010, but flattened out a bit in the wake of the Great Recession and the end of some of the fiscal stimulus associated with it. So the first thing we need to recognize right off the bat is today's funding levels are significantly higher than what policymakers and judges were looking at during the 1990s. It's pretty much a whole different ballgame in terms of school spending. This slide takes a look at the trends in the state and local contribution to education funding. As many people know, Ohio has something of a hybrid funding model whereby both state and local governments contribute to students' education. The federal government, of course, is involved as well, but at much lesser amounts. We'll come back to the issue of local taxes, but what we see here in this chart is increasing contributions at both the state and local levels to education funding from 1990 to 2017. On the state side, the state of Ohio contributed $7.2 billion in 1990, compared to $10.5 billion in 2017. Local revenues for education were $7.8 billion in 1990 versus $11.6 billion in 2017. Again, these figures are adjusted for inflation. I use the consumer price index to make that adjustment. There's alternative measures of inflation as well. But what we can see from this chart is that both state and local outlays have risen faster than the rate of inflation over this time period. Okay, so focusing more on the state's funding efforts, what we see here in this chart is that K-12 education has actually increased quite significantly as a portion of the state's budget. The year immediately prior to the filing of DeRolph in the county courts, K-12 education represented 36% of the state budget. In 2020, it represented 43% of the state budget. When I talk about the state budget, it actually refers to the state-only general revenue fund, lottery profits education fund, and local government fund, and it excludes the federal grants that are, including those designated for K-12 education that are administered by the state. So it really looks at K-12 education as a share of what the state is spending in terms of its own money. This chart actually came as a bit of a surprise to me, given that there's been a lot of talk about outlays on healthcare, but K-12 education has certainly kept pace as a state priority over this time. All right, so this slide shows school construction, trend in school construction outlays. And as I noted at the top, one of the main concerns in DeRolph was the condition of school facilities. There are a number of anecdotes at the trial that schools were worried about things like leaky ceilings and drafty school buildings and things like that. Those concerns are certainly valid and may have resonated in the 1990s, and there's certainly maintenance needs and construction needs still today, I'm sure. But what this figure does show is that Ohio has significantly increased its funding on school facilities. Construction and debt expenditures went from about $1.5 billion in the early 1990s to more than double that during the mid to late 2000s. This may have been a reflection of the state's new classroom facilities program that was launched in 1997. Capital outlays do seem to have declined a little bit more in recent years, but I think many people today in Ohio would agree that Ohio has made significant progress in addressing school facility needs. All right, shifting gears a bit to the issue of local property taxes, which remember was one of the factors that the DeRolph Court contributed to the what they call the unworkability of the funding system. This slide takes a look at the state-local split in funding education. And as I mentioned earlier, Ohio, like many other states, has something of a mixed model where the state contributes money to kids' education as well as local school districts. And what we see from this chart is that state and local revenues as a fraction of the overall funding have in Ohio since the 1990s played roughly equal roles in funding Ohio's education. In 2017, the local share is 47% and the state share is 43%. And that sort of tracks with the national trend that just about equally divides the tab between state and local governments. Some states, of course, rely more heavily on state funding. Those places are like Michigan and Indiana actually have a more state-centered model, while other states rely more heavily on local property taxes. Those are places like Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York. But overall, what we can see from this chart is that Ohio is not necessarily an outlier when it comes to funding education through property taxes. Continuing on the issue of property taxes, they're certainly easy to attack. No one, of course, likes paying them, and is probably politically savvy to complain about them if you're a lawmaker or politician. But they do need to be viewed with some nuance. I mean, there are some pros and cons to using them to fund schools. On the plus side, they do provide a relatively stable source of income for school districts. The second thing they do is they connect the benefits of education more closely to the taxpayer. So as we know, the local property taxes are basically used to fund kids in the local district's education. It's not redistributed to other parts of the state to fund other kids' educations. And then the third thing is that it provides a form of local accountability through the tax referenda process. So a lot of the local taxes have to be approved by a majority of a local district citizens. On the downside, as many of us know, relying on property taxes alone creates inequities in funding between school districts. So, that's fairly obvious if you just drive through Ohio that some districts have more property wealth than others. The second thing is that choice programs are denied local revenues. And third, if you read any of the news stories, the local news stories, a lot of people do tend to complain about having to go to voters for funding through the local tax referenda. And then the last thing I want to touch on local property taxes is what the DeRolph Court actually said about it. So on the one hand, they called it a factor that led to their decision, and certainly expressed concern about the use of local property taxes for education. But they also made this quote, which is really interesting. And what they say is, we recognize that disparities between school districts will always exist. By our decision today, we're not stating that a new financing system must provide equal educational opportunities for all, nor do we advocate for a Robin Hood approach to school finance reform. We're not suggesting that funds be diverted from wealthy districts and given to the less fortunate. And that's a sort of a striking quote in the sense that they seem to have recognized some of the dangers of moving drastically away from using property taxes and potentially leveling down school funding in Ohio rather than building up school funding. Okay, and so turning to the issue of equity. As noted earlier, one of the main concerns about using local property taxes is that real estate's values vary widely from district to district, and that can create inequities in funding. That would certainly be a big concern if Ohio only used property taxes to fund education, but the state, of course, doesn't do that. And when we look at overall spending levels, taking local, state, and federal contributions together, we see that high poverty districts tend to receive more funds than the state average. This is a chart using 2019 data from the state. In 2019, the average high poverty district spent $14,992 per pupil versus a state average of $12,472 per pupil. And then the wealthiest 20% of districts spent $12,387 per pupil. So all things considered, the overall funding system appears to be fairly equitable when we look at the total system as a whole. This slide displays a relationship between district state funding amounts, again, just state funding amounts, and districts' poverty levels. And what we see from this chart is that the state funding system distributes state aid in a reasonably what we might consider a progressive manner, delivering more dollars to districts that serve more low-income students. The upward trend line in red indicates that as poverty levels rise, the state contribution generally increases. The state contribution thus largely helps to offset the inequities in the local tax system. And then the federal contribution, which is about 10% in overall funding, also helps equalize funding as well. Turning last to some matters of school choice, the next two slides display the spending trends in the Ohio 8 districts. And I focus on these districts because they've seen the most growth in school choice enrollment over the years, whether that is public charter school enrollments or private school vouchers or scholarships since the early 1990s. If choice were hurting district finances, as many contend, we might expect to see steadily declining district spending. What we see from this chart, what we see from the next set of charts is actually somewhat the opposite. We see some evidence of increased spending in the Ohio 8 districts. While there are some ups and downs from 2000 to 2019 in all the districts, the general pattern shows an upward trend. Especially noticeable on this slide are the increases we see in Akron and Cleveland spending levels. This slide shows the spending trends from 2000 to 2019 in the last of the four of the big 8 districts. In Columbus, Dayton, and Toledo, we see some increases, again, some bumps up and down, but overall above the state average and also slightly increasing. In Youngstown, we see some significant increases in spending over time. So overall, when we look at the data, it appears that choice programs have not brought on serious fiscal hardship for school districts, at least those in the Ohio Big 8. A couple of takeaways to wrap up. Here's 5 key takeaways from the report itself. So first off, what we see from the data is that K-12 education expenditures have risen since the 1990s in inflation-adjusted dollars. The state devotes an increasing portion of its budget to K-12 education. The current state funding model delivers more overall aid to high poverty districts. And then overall spending in Ohio's high poverty districts is more than the state average. And last, school choice in urban areas has not eroded district per pupil funding. This is the last slide. In conclusion, certainly we're not here, or I'm not here to say that Ohio's school funding system is perfect. There are certainly challenges and things that can be refined and made better. And we can talk more about that with the remaining time, but we do need to acknowledge some of the strengths of the current system. So just to list a couple of them, one is that the current funding model requires all school districts to levy a minimum 2% property tax, what's also known by some as a 20 mil floor, to receive state aid. Second is that districts may supplement funding by asking local voters to approve higher tax rates. And then the state system itself helps to equalize funding and offset some of the inequities that we see at a local level. So it does so in a couple different ways. The current formula, which has been suspended for the current fiscal year, but the model that's in current law includes what's called the state share index, which helps equalize funding based on districts' property values, and in some cases, districts' resident income as well. The state funding formula includes extra categorical funding that's tied to student characteristics, including low-income students or economically disadvantaged, special education students, and English language learners. And then the current formula does include several smaller supplemental funding streams that help target additional supports to high poverty districts. These include what's known as targeted assistance, capacity aid, and then Governor DeWine's student success and wellness funding could also be viewed as another source of state aid that is especially targeted to high poverty districts. So that's everything I have today. I see that there's some questions, and I look forward to the conversation that follows. So thank you for joining us this morning and listening to some stuff about school finance. With that, I'll turn it over to Chad.
All right. Thank you very much, Aaron. Great job. I think there's a lot to talk about. Clearly, there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions. We've got a vibrant Q&A going on, and I think we need to get to those questions as quickly as we can. I'd like to start, though, with one question, and this is something I expect to hear. I could see some folks who are looking at this report and saying to themselves, well, here they go again. here's Fordham, anti-school funding, and not wanting to properly fund schools. So, and you know, or seeing this report as some sort of an attack on the Cupp-Patterson school funding plan. So how would you respond to critics? All of the attendees are too polite to ask this question, but I figured I'd start with that.
Yeah, Chad, you always ask the hard questions. So first of all, you know, this report was designed really to focus on the issues of constitutionality, not necessarily whether Ohio has a perfect system or not. As I mentioned at the end, you know, I think there are ways that the school funding system can be improved and made better. And the Cupp-Patterson plan, as I've written on our blog and in other places, I think there are strengths to the Cupp-Patterson plan, in that it you know, deals with some of the weaknesses in the system, including caps and guarantees, which provide some districts with more money than the formula should say, that's a guarantee, or less money than the formula says they should, which is cap. And those have been issues that you know, the Kasich administration raised up years ago as well, and then hopefully will be addressed the Cupp-Patterson plan if it passes ultimately. And then the other issue that we've talked a lot about at Fordham, and that the Cupp-Patterson plan addresses, is the direct funding of public charter schools. Rather than going through the deduct method and having charter school funds flow through school districts first, which creates a misconception that charter schools are somehow taking money away from the school district, or you know, even the district is financing charter schools themselves, when it's really the state. That needs to be done carefully. We've said that before. Chad had some great testimony in front of the legislature last week about that, where it needs to be, charters need to be funded out of the main appropriation in the state budget, and not a standalone line item, to protect them from budget cuts or even a veto possibly. And then the Cupp-Patterson plan also drives some more money for economically disadvantaged students, which I think is a plus too. But I think some of the rationale behind the Cupp-Patterson plan is that we're doing this in order to deal with the unconstitutionality of the funding system. And I think this report can contribute to that conversation, in the sense that at least call into question that rationale, and maybe, you know, say that the Cupp-Patterson plan should really be focused on students and making this a system that works for kids and works for parents, and maybe moving off a little bit from the rationale that we need to do this just in order to bring Ohio into alignment with the state constitution. And then the other issue that you raised was, you know, is Fordham, you know, saying that we should spend less on schools? And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I think it would it'd be great to fund, you know, low-income people's education in a more generous way, even though high poverty districts already do receive more money than the state average. And then, you know, and we also support, or at least I also support, you know, local supplementation through the local property tax system. If you're a school district that wants to, if you're a local community that wants to, you know, give the kids the bee's knees of education, you know, there's an outlet in order to do that. And I think that's actually a strength of the system, where the voters have a say in the school spending levels. So I don't know if that answers the question.
You did. You answered it very well. So let's dig into the attendees question.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really good ones here. I'll try to move through some of them that are more quickly, especially with the clarifying questions. So let's start with the first one. This is referring to slide 5. I looked it up as it was going. And so the question was, is the spending described here inclusive of all spending, local, state, and federal? So if you can bring up slide 5 for attendees to see. It was very early on in the presentation.
Is it
yes.
This one? Yes, that's it's expenditures. So it's all operational expenditures that schools have, and it would include the state, federal, and local contribution.
Okay, great. So let's see. Let's go on to another one. We'll go down the order. This had an upvote. By the way, attendees, if you see a question you really like and want to make sure we get to, especially since time might be limited, If you put an upvote, I guess, liking the question, then it'll help rise it in our rankings, especially if we can't get to all of them. So this question is from Wendy Patton, and she asks, does your analysis of growth and operational per pupil expenditures include the loss of TPP reimbursement promised and rescinded and repromised when the local business and utility tangible personal property taxes were eliminated / phased out between 2000 and 2013?
Yeah, that's I think that's referring to some changes in state law having to do with the treatment of business taxes, tangible personal property taxes. So this would capture, you know, those changes in state law that occurred between 2000 and 2013. You know, again, the slide right here captures the state contribution, the federal contribution, and the local contribution.
Okay. So because you didn't analyze where the money came from, but just the money, then you know, yeah. Okay. All right, we've got a question that's proving popular by Jack Archer. He says, I was a little taken aback that Aaron characterized local property taxes in the report as more stable than state allocations. In other states, including my own former one, a heavy reliance on local property taxes has been found to violate state constitutional provisions, specifically because it is less reliable as a revenue source than state funding in that voters can and do reject levy renewals.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, a great question. I think local property taxes are generally by many people considered to be more stable than state allocations, just because you know, even what we're seeing right now in terms of the economic issues is that state budget and state revenues can fluctuate. For instance, like the state sales tax or the state income tax may be more sensitive to economic, external economic conditions than local property tax. So I think that's a little bit where that is coming from. But I think in terms of like the revenue levels, so I think that's how I'd answer that question. I mean, certainly, I think you're right. Jack is right in saying that you know, the local revenues is dependent on passage, often dependent on the passage of local voters. So in that way, it can fluctuate. But in the sense of how sensitive the local tax is to external economic conditions, vis-a-vis the state revenues, sensitivity to economic conditions, I think the local taxes are considered more stable.
Yeah, so I won't go into, I won't add to that. I think that's a good answer talking about it. But the one thing I would add for those of you who haven't yet had an opportunity to read the report, Aaron looks at a little bit of the property taxes that it wasn't covered much in the presentation in some other states, Indiana and Pennsylvania, I think, or Michigan and Pennsylvania. And the fact that it's varied more in states that are dependent on property taxes, they've actually seen a steadier increase in school funding than in states that just relied on state revenues. And I think part of that maybe goes to one of the discussions we have in Ohio a lot, and that is funding what's referred to as residual funding. The state funds based on what money it has. And at some point, because of other conflicting priorities and other very important things that need to be funded, sometimes you could argue that the state maybe doesn't spend as much money as it might want to. So again, that's not advocating for one or the other, but just saying that the interaction between those various funding sources is pretty intricate. All right, well, Jack is popular, but I want to move on to ask another question. We'll come back up to his. So let's see. Here's a good one from, well, they're all good ones, so I'm not judging, but from Peter Petto, or sorry if I got your name incorrect. Do you believe the CPI's market basket of purchases is representative? Ooh, it moved on my screen. It is representative of a school district's expenditures. Are there no measures that might better match a service sector provider?
Oh, a question about measures of inflation. Okay.
So well, I think it's an important one.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I don't have a really strong opinion about, you know, which measure of inflation to use. I actually did look at spending trends using a different measure of inflation, which is called personal consumption expenditures measure. I think is what I call. I can't remember exactly what it is. It's the PCE, and I think the Federal Reserve uses it to target its inflation rate. And it has a slightly lower level of inflation than the CPI. And so, if you use a measure that is that reports lower inflation, then spending growth in schools is actually increased by a greater amount than if you use the CPI. So without going too much into measures of inflation, I do look at it in a different way, using a different measure.
So the only thing I would add to this is I think that's a great point. And I think, with this, we went with the most common measure that's used. And that's not necessarily saying it's correct. I could certainly see some areas where district costs for things like healthcare, we all know what's happened to healthcare costs over the years, and they have increased at a fast rate. And to the extent that's a large portion of a district's budget, you could certainly see a justifiable increase in district spending based upon those types of expenses. So that's great. We're not putting a value judgment on it per se, and it is the most commonly used effort. But I think that's a great question. So we need to be, we tried to consider the nuances of those variables, and there are a lot when you talk about school funding. So seems to be an interchange going on down here in one of the questions with some answers to it in the box. So let's go ahead and go there. Pete Van Leer asked a question. One of your slides shows the state has not in fact increased its share of school funding. It started at 43%, went up, and is now back at 43%. But you still said the state has increased its share. Please explain if I missed something. And then another attendee, Greg Lawson, responded, I believe his increase vis-a-vis the time of the DeRolph decisions. There was a decline during the Great Recession, and then added, I should clarify, the state has increased it since the Great Recession. So relative to the DeRolph decisions, the state is spending more. I presume it would have been even more in the absence of that. All right, so here we go. Great discussion. Thanks, guys, for contributing to that. And Aaron, how would you respond to Pete's question?
Yeah, I think if you look at, there's certainly a bump in 2009 or 2010 where it went up to 43%. I think, the main point I wanted to drive home with this chart was that, the state K-12 education is, as a portion of the state budget, the state-owned GRF is higher than it was in the 1990s, which is sort of the baseline for tracking change. So that there are a couple of years where it matched today's, but it's higher by a couple percentage points than it was in the late 90s or early 90s.
And Pete just clarified that he was referencing another slide. But yes, clearly you're right, Pete. The percentage of school funding that the state takes up versus the local is still 43%. But part of the discussion has also been whether the state has reduced its funding of education or whether it's no longer funding it. And what we're seeing actually is, as a percentage of state funding, which is a slide Aaron was previously on, that that the state is spending more of its dollars towards supporting education. So, of course, that's not saying it's enough. It's just saying it's more. So, but that's a great question, and thank you for highlighting that, because I think when you say the state's spending a larger portion, it could be seen vis-a-vis local governments rather than what Aaron was pointing out related to the percentage of the state budget. All right, so now we got some more questions here. Here's one from Peggy Sorensen. Equity is based on an assumption of meeting a range of needs. How have you accounted for variable needs of students in your model? And about the highest quintile, is there reason to believe that those students have a higher need than the middle three? So I'm going to start with the second half of this question, Aaron, and let you noodle on the first half. So can you bring up that slide that shows the funding by quintiles? Yeah. So Peggy, you had the same reaction I did when I saw the spending by quintile. And I think what we're seeing here is you've got, as you would expect, quintile 1, the poorest districts, if the state has a system that's trying to drive equity, should and is sending more dollars there. Again, this isn't saying it's enough necessarily. But then why then do you have the outlier in the wealthiest district? And I think this is a matter that the court actually discussed, in that our goal is not to take funding from one district and get to another, but you've got some of the wealthiest districts in Ohio have chosen and gone to local taxpayers to support schools at a higher level than the state school funding formula and the local contribution to that might otherwise generate. So this is an important question, because from a policy perspective, what do you do? Do you prohibit them from taxing themselves and spending money on their own schools, or do you allow it? When you allow it, I think this is sort of the result that you get. Now the question is, if they spend more on themselves, do you then increase, do you then send more state dollars to school districts in quintiles 2, 3, and 4? Well, then what you're doing is you're letting expenditures in one district drive them in the other ones. So I think this is a really, really difficult issue for policymakers to figure out how to respond to. I don't have the answer to that, but I think that's a great observation. And I think you clearly make the case the needs are not highest in quintile 5, given what we know about education and the additional costs needed to treat students who face various hurdles. So I don't know, is there still more you want to say about the first part of your question, Aaron?
No, I appreciate taking the hard one. No, I think
No,
I think equity is a super important issue. I think there's a couple different ways you can think about equity in terms of school finance. One is what a lot of people call vertical equity, which is, if you have higher need kids, so for instance, a lot of low income students or special education or students that have, since that many of us think, it costs more to educate, they should receive more money to educate those students because they have higher needs. And so this chart is sort of focusing on the issue of vertical equity, where we sort of want to see districts and the poorest districts receiving more money. How much more money is certainly an open question, and a difficult one at that. But what we see from the chart is that they actually do receive more money, which is a good starting point to understand. But how much more money is definitely a challenge to figure out. The other concept in terms of school finance is what we call horizontal equity, which is where a student with basically the same, very similar students would be funded at equal levels, and that's often the concern that we at Fordham think about with respect to charter school students, where basically the same student in Columbus is funded at very different levels. The charter student would be funded at about $10,000 versus $15,000 for a district student, and that's a different type of concept of equity than the vertical concept.
Well, Aaron, I think that. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, both important. Thank you.
I think that leads into another question. It's a great segue into a question by John Dews. John asks, is there any discussion around the constitutionality question specific to public charters? If DeRolph was partially about the over-reliance on local property taxes and funding public schools, and public charters don't have any access to these funds, how do policymakers view this inequity? That's a great question, John, and I'll take this, Aaron, and if I miss any parts of it, please correct me, as I know you will. So John, in general, I don't think there has been any sort of organized challenge to the way charter schools are funded in the state of Ohio. I know Fordham has written some reports and has analyzed the funding available to public charters, and we've identified the gap. I think Aaron has mentioned it. In terms of total taxpayer support, charter schools in the Ohio 8 receive roughly 72 cents on the dollar compared to what a traditional public school student similarly would receive. We think this is a big issue. I think one of the things you look at is in-school funding lawsuits is the incredible expense related to it. And that is bringing those cases is extraordinarily difficult, and winning is not necessarily a certainty. I think that at the same time, I think you can see something similarly playing out in the traditional public schools. While the Supreme Court in the final DeRolph case basically washed its hands of it and said, we're stepping back, Clearly, there would have been avenues over the last 17 years, certainly after the first 5 or so after the court dispensed with the case, that that another factual argument could have been made. And what we've seen is it has not been challenged to this point. So I think there are some hurdles to bringing a case related to resources and that support. We certainly view the problem of inequity facing charter schools as a very real one, especially in an era where, you know, charter schools disproportionately serve low-income and minority students. So we do think there's an issue there, but at least at this point, I know in the discussion, Mr. Van Leer also noted the discussion related local dollars versus state dollars that really makes the discussion very difficult when trying to figure out how to get more equity in the charter school sector. I anticipate as school funding discussions go forward, you'll continue to hear more about this issue though. All right, there's another one down, Aaron. I took one for you. So let's go with Jack Archer has one that is has the most upvotes right now. So let's go back to Jack for one more question here. What is the constitutional standard for funding adequacy in Ohio? Is there one? Did the DeRolph Court leave the question so open that it is simply whatever the legislature decides it is at any time, or believe would survive a legal challenge? A longer question is with reference to funding litigation in other states, but I'll leave it at that. Well, you put plenty in there, Jack, even if you're going to leave it at that. So, Aaron, do you want to take a crack at this?
Yeah, in my reading of you know, what happened with DeRolph is that there's not a constitutional standard for adequacy. I think, you know, the definition of adequacy is pretty ambiguous. You know, it can be sort of what you want to make it. They raised concerns about, you know, the base cost and the methodology behind that at the time, and it's also something that the Cupp-Patterson plan, you know, takes a crack at to try to you know, get a handle on what the average cost to educate kids is. You know, I think when the issue of adequacy in the base cost, you know, sort of it's sort of curious, you know, in the sense that the base cost in Ohio right now is 60/20 for the opportunity grant, which is the main portion of the state foundation program. But we spend way more than that in terms of the average student in Ohio. We spend about $12,000. You know, it makes me wonder whether, you know, the 12,000 number should really be what we talk about in terms of adequacy rather than the base cost amount. But, you know, to my knowledge, there's not necessarily a firm standard on what exactly
all right,
the adequate amount is.
Yeah, and you know, I think based on the experience of courts in other states, courts will sometimes venture into the adequacy issue and often do. Most of them don't seem to be happy after they've done so. It's really hard for a court to really weigh in and actually determine what the amount is, given the legislature holding the power of the purse. So it's a very difficult conflict that I think courts have, even when they recognize a system that is egregious. So, thanks for the question. All right. So here's a bit of a comment more than a question, but I know this is from Angel Stickler. She's had a few questions, so I wanted to make sure, and comments. So I wanted to make sure to recognize one of them. This one has an upvote. It says, maybe school districts should be paid on merit. School choice is the best option for children. School districts funnel money through federal dollars from Title I, IDEA, prevention dollars, et cetera, giving them no incentive to teach the students they serve as they lose money then. So Angel, thank you for the question and the comment. You know, in this report, we really, certainly those of us at Fordham are school choice advocates. In this question, in this report, we chose not to go too deeply into that because of just the pervasiveness of the school funding question and the importance of it. While we do mention choice, this isn't a report about school choice. Clearly, we're on the side of team school choice and do want to empower parents to have options, and we think that's very important. But this report doesn't go into tremendous detail on that, except to note some of the discrepancies in funding that we've talked about. So, but thank you very much for that comment. Here's an important one, another important question I think from Wendy Patton. Growth in per pupil spending by district slide. Since charters and vouchers are paid out of district funding, how can you make the claim that the increase in district expenditures reveals that choice is not impacting funding? It encompasses choice districts, does it not? So I think this is a very important one, Aaron. And I know that some prior studies, especially national studies, that haven't understood the nuance of Ohio, got in a little trouble about how they handled the deducts for choice programs. How did you tackle that when you were doing this work in this analysis?
Yeah, so I'm trying to understand the question a little bit better.
I think what she's saying is,
Yeah.
let me moderator's prerogative. I think what she's saying is, if in this slide, if Akron is funding lots of kids that are in charter schools and those are deducted, that the 15,000 per pupil isn't really going to Akron. Some percentage is being taken out and given to charter schools. How did you handle the deduct?
Okay. Yeah, so gotcha. I think I understand a little better. So in terms of the data source, I'm using the Ohio Department of Education's data, which on the expenditure side just looks at expenditures that the district spend on district students. So this is, if you look at the slide on Cleveland, Cleveland School District spends, about 18 plus a little bit of change per pupil on its own students in 2019. So it accounts for the deducts. It's not looking at how much is being spent on charter students or anything like that. It's important to note that actually in the source at ODE that the revenue side data doesn't properly account for the deductions, but the expenditure side does.
Okay, so you used expenditure data rather than revenue data to make sure that you did not count those. Great, that's a good question, a very technical question, but an important one for people to know. So Greg Lawson asked, what is the impact on operational spending that goes towards the growth of administrative versus teaching staff?
Yeah, so I have a couple charts in the report. If I'm sure everybody's going to read it after this.
I think Greg has already read that report, so I think that's where his question comes from.
There's a couple of charts, and I look a little bit at trends in pupil to teacher ratios and some of that stuff, because one of the interesting things in DeRolph is they said that the schools are lacking teachers and staff and that sort of thing. And what we see over the past 20, 25 years is that the overall staff to pupil ratio has fallen quite significantly. So there are more adults for each individual student in Ohio on average. And a lot of that, if you look at the data, is an increase in support staff personnel. So one of the interesting things that's sort of happened over the past 25 years is that schools have really staffed up it appears that schools have really staffed up in terms of their support staff, but haven't really done so with teachers, at least not in a proportionate way. And the other interesting thing that's happened over the 25 years is that teacher salaries have actually been pretty flat, even as school spending has gone up. So it appears that schools are spending some of the increases they're seeing in revenues on support staff and other positions besides teachers, or even teacher salary increases.
All right, let's do it. We've got a time check. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Let's go with Rachel Jones here, asking a question on Cupp-Patterson. Well, the report isn't about that. Want to make sure we try to get at least a question from everyone if we can. So Ms. Jones asks, the Cupp-Patterson bill proposes a joint legislative task force to analyze transportation expenses related to CNP schools. How do you anticipate this impacting the transportation operations and funding for district schools transporting students attending community schools?
I haven't studied the transportation provisions in Cupp-Patterson enough to really know.
Well, you see, there I go. I get you into trouble at the very end.
No, I mean, I think under current law, school districts are required to transport students who go to public charter schools in their school district. and also chartered non-public schools, otherwise known as private schools. Hopefully that'll continue, whatever that may
So,
be.
and I think that's a great question, Rachel. And the truth is, I don't think any of us quite know exactly what that task force would come up with. I do think that there are a lot of legislators that have been deeply committed to the long-term notion that transportation should be provided for students to attend schools of choice. Now, it's not complete. Certainly open enrollment isn't included. I would anticipate whatever comes forward would continue to have that requirement, as Aaron suggested. I also think that that looking at this situation, we realize how difficult the transportation issue is for school districts and for community schools and for chartered non-public schools. I think everyone tries to do the best they can, but I think results vary widely by district, by area, and by the number of students that are in this. It's a incredibly complex task, getting kids there with different school start times and kids going all over cities, especially in some of our larger cities. I think we see that a lot. So I don't see that that's an issue or a challenge that's going away anytime soon, unfortunately. I wish there was an easy solution, but I guess if there was an easy solution, we would have done it. So, all right. Let's see. I guess we've got time for one more question. Seeing if there's anybody who I haven't read a question from yet. All right. No, I think we're generally good on that. I guess we'll go with the most upvotes then. Jack gets one more. Ohio's funding system seems to pass a reasonable test of equity. How great a concern should there be from a constitutional standpoint, however, when the state fails to maintain the state's funding formula and adds caps and guarantees that, as Aaron says, undermine the equity goals of the system? So let me start with that, Aaron, and then I'll let you clean up if I miss anything. The whole notion of caps and guarantees is something we've railed against at Fordham for a long time. I certainly understand. I understand how we've gotten there as a state, but if you're going to have a state funding formula, you need to fund it. And so the Cupp-Patterson plan has certainly talked a lot about caps and guarantees, and I think they do try to take some efforts to do it, but even then, there's they've devised a system where no one gets less funds. So in some ways, the guarantee goes away, from that from that perspective, from that framework. If everybody gets more money, of course, then the guarantee is met. I think the state has a big challenge with the caps. For a district like the city of Columbus or Columbus City Schools to miss out on, I believe, a couple of years ago, it was $100 million. To serve the students that are actually in that district, I think is a question that needs to be pushed really hard on, especially as we suggest, as we have discussions about equity. Columbus serves students who come to school with enormous economic challenges and educational challenges associated with that. So I think we'll never truly have a system that works until the formula is comprehensive enough and works well enough that and we have the resources available to actually fund it. That continues to be a big challenge, and I'm not positive yet whether Cupp-Patterson gets us there or if we need even additional refinements. So, Aaron, anything to add on that question? Otherwise, I think it's time to say goodbye to our attendees today.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I really appreciate the everybody's questions. They were great, and appreciate the conversation about school funding. And read the report.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. Just to let you know, in January, we're likely going to have another event. This one will be on open enrollment and its impact on student diversity. So it should be a really interesting presentation and event that will be based on a paper by University of Oklahoma professor Devin Carlson. So stay tuned for that. And then early to mid next year, we're going to be having a report looking at gifted education in the state of Ohio. So I won't say too much about that until we have a date, until it's more certain. But thank you for joining us today. And hopefully it was truly an energizing discussion on school funding. Thanks everyone.